Well, a new report uses tax data to conclude high-tax states face a weak economic future. Joining us from Washington is the chief economist and vice president of the American Legislative Exchange Council, Jonathan Williams. He also co-authored this report, which is called Rich States, Poor States, and looks at the tax regimes in these various states. So thank you so much for joining us. So break it down for us. I mean, essentially, your conclusion is that higher tax states are disadvantaged. What data are you using to come to that conclusion?
Well, first, happy tax day, if you can say that. It's been fun to watch this report grow over the last dozen years or so that we put it together with Art Laffer and Steve Moore, looking at the states and how much states are different from each other when they come to their own state tax policies and regulatory climates, labor policies. Those are really the three areas that we look at in terms of the rich states, poor states economic outlook. And we put together 15 different equally weighted factors, things that Art Laffer has followed for 50 different years to see, what are the states doing out there when it comes to public policy? How can state legislators affect change? And the things we look at are very interesting in that, first of all, we know they matter to economic growth. Art Laffer studied this for decades. But secondly, I think it's just as important, really, that there are things that state legislators in their state capitals control, because there's really a proliferation of indices, lots of different ways people like to rank states. But if state lawmakers in their capitals have no control over the policies, what good is it? So this ranking, I think, gives a comprehensive view both for policymakers across the 50 state capitals as well as concerned taxpayers as they go to think a little bit more about taxes this week.
So, Jonathan, I appreciate your being here, and let me try and boil this down into a statement and then correct me when I get it wrong or say, yes, you got it right, Adam. The premise here is that high tax states, going forward, the economic growth doesn't look good because of the high taxes in places like New York. I think it was either number 49 or 50 on the list. But when you look at one of the metrics you're using, GDP growth over a 10-year period, New York was number 3, and there's nothing new about high taxes in New York. Had them greater than 10 years. So what am I missing here? Because it seems to me that the high taxes in New York have not slowed down or hurt its GDP growth.
Right. So when we look at performance of the states, we look at GDP growth, we look at overall income growth, we look at migration across the states. In fact, taxpayer migration across the 50 states is one of, I think, the greatest things to look at, in that it's a revealed preference, as we say in economics, and that people are picking up and voting with their feet, voting with their pocketbooks, and going from state to state over years. And New York, while it may have been catching up on GDP growth over the last decade, New York is down about 1.3 million Americans on net to the other 49 states over that same time period. Meanwhile, Texas is up about 1.3 million Americans. Florida's up nearly 1 million. So we find in our report a very strong correlation between states with high tax burdens and overall anti-business policies and high out-migration of taxpayers and businesses. And of course, even Andrew Cuomo makes my point more recently, complaining about the SALT limitation of federal tax reform being capped at $10,000 and what that's going to do to the price of doing business and living in New York, as he's even seeing this out-migration intensify to places like Florida and Texas with no income taxes whatsoever.
I just wanted to bring in Akiko Fujita, who's one of our reporters who's on set here, just joining us. Welcome, Akiko, who wanted to ask you a question.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on your point about, I think you described it as taxpayer migration. We were just showing some of those numbers of residents lost in high tax states like New York or California. Can you speak to the business side of things? Because it seems like we've been hearing a lot, especially from some of these tech companies out in California, about the high taxes they pay and sort of this push to maybe move out of state in areas where there is similar talent, which still seems to be a bit of a challenge.
Right, workforce development's a huge issue, but then again, we look at some areas where we've seen a lot of tech development, such as Salt Lake City, such as Austin, Texas. States that have gotten serious about good policy across the board are now really capitalizing on California's misfortune of getting business taxes and costs overall too high for more than a decade. California ranks in our bottom 10 in rich states, poor states. Meanwhile, Utah, one of the huge tech hubs that's now really growing, especially in the Salt Lake City area. Utah's been #1 in rich states, poor states for economic outlook, actually all dozen years of this publication. So we see we have 50 laboratories of democracy, and that's the great thing about federalism is states compete with each other. And based on our research, both businesses on the business side as well as individuals are voting with their feet, voting with their pocketbooks, and going to states that keep overall taxes low and have a healthy business environment.
Well, the beauty of the real-world laboratory is we'll also get to see if you're right about these forecasts over time. Thank you so much, Jonathan Williams, ALEC Chief Economist.